Neither these works nor this rather untraditional museum appears on our list, but I think it's a good place to review my last lecture and to dive into our next topic, which is environmental art or in situ art, that is, art very much tied to a particular place, even when, as in the case of the gates, it's only there for a brief period. So, does anyone remember the term for this artistic style? You saw it in the steel cubie of David Smith, also no longer required. The term is minimalism, but it's also closely associated with formalism. That is, the focus on materials, composition, and structure of a work as opposed to its subject. In fact, many formalists actually rejected having an explicit subject. But of course, what really draws our eye to these abstract minimalist works is not just their stark shapes, but even more the exquisite natural setting where they've been installed. So before we move on to our first required work, I want to pause for a moment and think about the difference that setting can make to art. The Storm King Outdoor Art Museum is located in the Hudson River Valley, about an hour north of New York City. I checked out the museum website and I discovered that works by 4 of our required artists are installed on its grounds. None of these works is required. I've stuck the required work by the artist up in the corner of each slide. But I want to look at these works quickly just to think about the impact and how the impact and even the meaning changes when a work is placed outside in the midst of nature. As you'll learn a few lessons from now, this artist was a child in Nazi-occupied Poland. She actually saw her mother's arm shot off. And a young adult in Soviet-dominated Poland, where she was forced to produce socialist realist art, which she didn't like. Her work focuses heavily on human loss and suffering. Note that our required sculpture has neither legs nor innards. The Storm King sculpture is actually composed of casting molds that were once used by a European weapons manufacturer. So surely this work is somehow about death, sarcophagi after all, and about war and about vulnerability. But how does the setting change the impact or message of the piece? Well, I'm the disembodied voice, so I don't get to hear what you just said. But what strikes me is that in the open air, we see and feel the vulnerability of glass houses and people to objects that might fall from the sky, like bombs from airplanes, maybe. She, by the way, grew up on a country estate. I think this might evoke that as well. So what does the sitting figure remind you of? And what do you think's going on here? Well, it's a Buddha. Pike is famous as a pioneer of video-based art. Again, stay tuned. But what do you think changes when his symbols move out of a gallery and into the great outdoors? Okay, I'm going to cheat and read from the museum website. The work features some elements typical of Pike's interior artificial landscapes: scattered televisions, plastic castings of TV consoles, and representations of the Buddha. In Pike's work, television often represents a landscape of contemporary America and assumes a shrine-like role, as it does in modern society. Installed outdoors, waiting for the UFO takes on additional significance, suggesting unanswerable questions about the relationship between technology and nature. Old empty television consoles dropped haphazardly onto the ground appear almost like technological ruins. Pike also included artificial flowers, bronze and stone Buddhas, and solemn bronze masks of himself, staring blankly up toward the heavens. So does the work suggest that technology or its detritus has overtaken nature or merged with it? It's kind of an interesting introduction to an artist who's coming. So this is an earth sculpture created by the young architect who won the contest to build the Vietnam Veterans Memorial when she was a 21-year-old undergraduate at Yale. She sculpted this site using soil and gravel, creating a drainage system and planting it with sustainable grasses. So what does this work evoke for you? The artist herself named 2 influences behind this work, and both of them you know. Any guesses? One is the Serpent Mound in Ohio. The other is Japanese dry gardens with their carefully raked piles and paths of stone. And just to round out the list, here's a work created by Claes Oldenburg and his wife. I actually think it looks less incongruous than most of his works. We're more likely to encounter drainage pipes than giant lipsticks or typewriter erasers when we walk outside. Okay, finally, our first required work and our very own Utah artwork. I'm showing you this video clip because it includes footage from a documentary that the artist made about the work, and also because it gives you a look at a different work by Christo and Jeanne-Claude coming up next. So now that you've seen the video, I should mention that Spiral Jetty is back above water. So just in purely formal terms, where does this work belong? Which category? Well, it's minimalist in design and rather abstract, and yet it is set in nature, and it's intended in at least some ways to mimic nature. The artist also has a political and social purpose. He wants to draw attention to the natural environment and to encourage viewers to venture out into remote places in order to see this art. So I forgot to do this in my last lecture, but let's start now. What are your candidates for 3 things you should remember about this work? Here are a few ideas from me. This work of art, like nature itself, changes over time. The salt incrustation has turned the originally black basalt white. The work is sometimes underwater, sometimes above water, and it will probably eventually be reclaimed by the lake. The artistic instruments weren't brushes or pencils. They were 2 dump trucks, a large tractor, and a front loader hired in Ogden to haul 6,650 tons of rock and earth into the lake. I was curious about the spiral shape. Here's what the College Board says in a grading rubric for an earlier question on this work. Quote, Smithson was interested in the power of the spiral form, both in nature and art, long before he arrived at the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Present in forms large and small, spiritual and organic, the spiral is associated with growth, change, and rebirth. Any of you ever walked a labyrinth? But just to complicate this picture, here's some information I found on a scientific website that discusses this work. In the spiral jetty, the gap between the spiral's curves is kept constant. So it's an Archimedean spiral, not logarithmic one found in nature, as in the chambered nautilus, a popular symbol of organic growth. This further separates Smithson's jetty from the natural world. So what do you think? Was Smithson channeling nature or messing with nature or both? On the slide, I've reproduced another comment from the College Board grading rubric for the same question. In fact, there are some people who think the spiral jetty should be restored with new black basalt. What do you think? Should it be preserved or left to disintegrate, left to entropy? So these are sun tunnels by installation artist Nancy Holt, who's Smithson's widow. Believe it or not, these are also in Utah near Wendover. The sun tunnels are cited to relate to the sun at the summer solstice, harking back to Stonehenge. Okay, not required, but it's more Utah art. On the video, you also saw works by installation artists Christo and Jeanne-Claude. Their stated goal is to promote awareness of the environment, rural and urban, by modifying that environment, that landscape, with cloth. These environmental art projects are enormously complicated and expensive, especially since they usually require multiple government permits. The artists raise the money for the projects from private sources. So here are 2 famous examples. Here are a few other projects. Since it's a neighboring state, you might be interested to know that there's currently, it's almost over probably, a big fight going on in Colorado over Christo's plan to drape almost 6 miles of fabric over the Arkansas River. The Bureau of Land Management approved the project, and in January 2015, a federal court upheld the approval, but local residents and environmental groups are still fighting the decision, claiming that Christo's art will despoil an area of natural beauty. I don't think the final court case has come down, although it should soon, and I could be wrong. So, is environmental art actually good for the environment? Does it draw attention to natural beauty or mar it? What do you think? Anyway, here is our required work. And what would you list as the big 3 here? I'm not sharing my own answer, by the way. Instead, we're going to pause for a short essay break. I want you to compare the 2 works we just looked at, Spiral Jetty and The Gates. And your question has 2 parts. It's up on Moodle. 1, what is one similarity and one difference between the artist's intentions in producing these works? Back your statement, as always, this is true of all essays. You're going to be hearing a lot about this from me this month. Back your statement with evidence for the work based on visual evidence from the work or what you know of the historical context, or ideally both. The second part of the question is, what is one similarity and one difference in the way the viewer perceives or interacts with these works? You have 10 minutes. Okay, back to the disembodied voice. I'll be reading your essay soon, but let me share a few thoughts. I think it's intriguing that Christo's projects are deliberately temporary. Smithson's are not eternal, but he clearly intended the spiral to be around for a long time. So what difference does this make in the viewer's response? What does Christo himself say about the temporary nature of his work? And the answer was in your reading. I thought it was very interesting. I'd also note that both works invite direct participation by walking a path. Does this remind you of any other participatory art we've studied? What about circumnambulating a stupa or the Kaaba, or moving through the ambulatory in a Romanesque pilgrimage church to visit altars with relics, walking into the center of a Hindu temple? Sometimes I think you should keep in mind throughout this unit is the contemporary artists sometimes envy and sometimes try to recapture the spiritual power of earlier art and the elements of performance that was associated with so much of this art. So this was part of what attracted Picasso to African masks. It wasn't just their clean lines and stylized abstraction, although I think he did like that, but also the way the wearer assumed a spiritual persona, even a link with gods and ancestors. Many of these artists want to restore this sense of spiritual power or the performance aspect of art, even in a more secular age. Which segues nicely into our third work of environmental art, the Vietnam War Memorial. Before we listen to the artist give a short description of her own work, I'd like you to talk briefly about how this work might fit into the tradition of spiritual work, such as stupas, temples, and churches. So now let's hear from Maya Lin. Note that the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial combines minimalism, sculptural architecture, and earthworks environmental art all into one moving package. It also incorporates words, specifically the names of every soldier who died in the war. This would be a great work to choose if you were given a question asking you to analyze art that incorporates text. So, what would you list as the big three? Okay, this time I am going to take a turn. You need to know the controversial history of this work. The reading gave you this background, and so did the video you just saw. I was curious about the original contest. What was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, that's the nonprofit that sponsored the memorial, looking for? What did they tell the contestants? And this is what I found. The committee said it was looking for a design that fit the following adjectives, and this isn't a complete list: contemplative, harmonious, reflective, conciliatory. The competition booklet concluded with the following passage: "We wish to repeat that the memorial is not to be a political statement, and that its purpose is to honor the service and the memory of the war's dead, its missing, and its veterans, not the war itself. The memorial should be conciliatory, transcending the tragedy of the war." Maya Lin herself described the memorial as a sculpture cut into the earth like a knife. Others have described it as a wound that is closed and healing, which of course still makes it a wound. The setting is incredibly important. One wall points toward the Washington Monument, the other in the direction of the Lincoln Memorial, and both of these, of course, are white rather than black, which is a major reason why the memorial sparked so much controversy. Yet the polished black granite's mirror-like surface, which reflects back those who come to mourn and honor the dead, makes it possibly Washington's most participative monument, and it's turned out to be, after the initial controversy, enormously popular. And finally, you should know about the compromise that was finally reached with the memorial's critics, a compromise that the architect herself strongly opposed. So these two more traditional statues, one of soldiers, one of military nurses, were erected on the site. So what do you think? Did these detract from the monument, or did they help heal the wound? Okay, I'm going to admit that I've been struggling with how to present our last required work, which is Narcissus Garden. So let's start with just looking at it as an installation with moving parts. Think about what the guy who made this video is doing and what this might tell you about the artist's intent. So what's he doing? He's looking at mirror balls floating through the water, which means he's also looking at himself. And in fact, he is photographing himself, looking at himself. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was a hunter and the son of a river god. He was known for his great beauty, and he was also known for how much he admired his great beauty. Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution, didn't like this, so she lured him to a pool. There he saw his own reflection in the water, and he fell in love with it, did not realize he was just looking at a mirror image of himself. He was unable to leave the beauty of his own reflection. He lost the will to live, stared at his reflection until he died. Narcissus is the origin of the term narcissism. I think I put too many syllables into that. At any rate, a fixation with oneself and one's physical appearance. So, in this garden, we all become Narcissus, right? The installation isn't always created on water, but given the story and water's reflective power, it seems especially appropriate. Well, in some ways, the term narcissism also sums up this artist's career. When I talked about Jeff Koons, I ended up talking more about the artist than his art. It's hard not to do the same thing for Yayoi Kusama. Like Koons, she is a relentless self-promoter. Like Koons, she straddles the line between mocking art's increasing commercialism and commercializing her own art. Here you see Kusama with her signature polka dot art and the bag she designed for Louis Vuitton. You can get one of these on eBay for about $2,000. Kusama grew up in Japan, and when she was trained in traditional Japanese painting, which she rebelled against, she also suffered from bouts of what she herself describes as a mental illness that included visions of herself covered with shapes, including the signature polka dot. In 1957, Kusama moved to New York City and became, by terms, an abstract expressionist, a pop artist, and yet those are what you think they are, stuffed and covered with polka dots. Not the real thing, of course. She became a minimalist, and she was a promoter of performance art gatherings or happenings, a feature of the anti-war movement, also the hippie movement. In this photo, the artist is the one who gets to keep her clothes on. Everybody else wears polka dots. So Yayoi Kusama became pretty well known in the New York art scene, but she did not make much money from her art. In 1968, she more or less invaded the Venice Biennale, which is a very important biennial exhibition of contemporary art that had been running since the late 19th century. She wasn't invited to exhibit. Instead, she set up her mirror balls outside the exhibit, and she sold them to passersby. The trick gained her a lot of attention, some would say notoriety. In 1973, the artist moved back to Tokyo, and in 1977, she admitted herself to a mental institution where she's continued to live when she isn't attending the increasingly successful exhibitions of her work or selling her fashion accessories. So, what 3 points do you want to remember about this work, and what do you think of it? If you have time, I think you might enjoy this BBC interview with the artist.